All right, welcome back, guys, with another video. For today, what we're going to be talking about is something that, if you recall from one of my earlier videos, I believe it was my either first or second one, I took a bit of time where I was talking about my experience with the gym and what changes I made earlier on to really maximize how efficient I was with achieving the goals that I have or that I had at the time. And one of the things that I believe I mentioned was this whole concept of progressive overload. And progressive overload might be something that you've heard of before in either a video from someone that you follow or maybe something that you read up online. But in my opinion, I feel like progressive overload, the definition of it, or at least in the context of fitness, I feel like a lot of times, and this goes with a lot of the like other topics when it comes down to fitness, I feel like the definition for that has gotten way too complicated, or at least it's defined in a pretty complicated way by some people, at least more than I feel like is necessary. When it comes down to fitness, and something that I mentioned before, I really try to find ways for fitness to complement my life. I really don't think it's something that for me at least, wanted to take over my life. I do enjoy it a lot. I like to research on it or do a bit of research on it. But by no means is it something that, I kind of view as something that's the only thing that I do in my day to day. To some people, that might be the case, but for me, that's just not really how I want to really utilize my time. I like to do other things and really put time and effort into other areas as well. So, because of that, I try to keep anything like fitness related in terms of the information that I look up online or really things that I just apply to my own programming. I try to keep things as simple as possible. And I feel like a lot of people can really benefit from thinking that way when it comes down to fitness because I understand that when someone's going through the process of trying to make a change within their life when it comes down to fitness, something that's pretty major for a lot of people. But by no means do I feel like it's something that, you constantly need to almost worry about or stress about. It's something that if you follow a decent plan, it's something that you can just kind of do and act on day to day without really having to think too much about it. It should be a pretty seamless process for you, at least for most people, just so it doesn't really complicate your life a lot more than it probably already is. And also, I feel like especially with people just starting out with fitness, if you complicate something a lot from the beginning, it tends to turn people away. And when it comes down to fitness, it really doesn't need to be like that. I feel like, again, there's a lot of content out there that does that, but I'm going to try to keep these videos as simple and pretty much clear cut as possible. So you just take away the things that you need. And again, these are all things that are just coming from my experience. I'm not some sort of medical expert when it comes down to this. I'm just a guy that likes to lift weights, and that's it. So, I'm going to show you what has worked for me, and hopefully it's something that can benefit you as well. So, saying all that, back onto the topic of progressive overload. Now, this is something that, again, you might have heard of before. There's really a ton of different ways in which I've seen it being defined, but how I really just view it for myself and how I feel it can be applicable to pretty much everyone is just trying to be better than last time. That's really all there is to it. Now, better can be in a couple of different ways, and we're going to talk about that here soon. But really, that's the whole purpose of progressive overload is you just progressively getting better at something that you're doing. So in other words, just doing better than your previous attempt, right? And again, how you do that can be done in a couple of different ways. Now, some of the more common ways, maybe that you've even heard of before, are things such as increasing the weight or adding an extra repetition than maybe your previous attempt. Those are all very valid ways in which you can apply progressive overload, but those aren't really the only ways to do so. And we're going to talk about some of the other ways here in a second. But before we get to that point, before we even start going into progressive overload and really understanding some of the ways in which you can do that and why it's important, because we're going to be talking about, how we did compared to our previous attempt, we're going to be making a lot of comparisons. And because of that, I really recommend all of you to document your lifts or to write notes on them. This can be done in either your phone, you can write them down through a journal. That's personally what I do. But something that you can look back on just so you have a log of what you did. That is going to be super important just so you don't forget and leave these comparisons up to chance. As an example, say for instance, I want to try to beat my previous attempt on the barbell bench press from last week. And I'm trying to do that this week, but I don't have it written down. I kind of forgot. There's a lot of things that happened since then, and I forgot. If you keep up that process of forgetting, it's really going to limit your ability to just continuously improve. Why risk that? Why have that chance if you really want to keep things as efficient as possible and for you not to, have to think too much about it? Just write it down. Just write it down. Once you're done with the lift, again, you can do it on your phone or you can do it afterwards when you get home. Just write down what you did at the gym. I did barbell bench press for 2 sets, and each of those sets I did it for 6 repetitions. Right, write that down in whatever way makes the most sense for you. I would love to show you guys my journal, but it's going to look like a mess probably to a lot of you because I write that thing in such a way that just makes sense for me since I'm the only one that uses it, right? But again, that fundamental kind of topic that I just talked about of me just writing down what I did, that's how it is. I'm just writing things or writing down what I did. But again, I just make the most sense to me. So I do a lot of abbreviations and stuff like that. But again, big thing here before we even get into how to progressive overload with all your movements, make this process easier for yourself. Just write it down. Again, that process of writing things down will speed up over time. So just better to kind of form that habit from the beginning and just kind of stick with it, later down the road. Maybe later down the road, you don't have to do it as much. I still have kept doing it up until this point, and it helps me. I don't really have to kind of look back and think too hard on what I did. I just look at my notes and that's literally it. So big thing there, just look at your notes or write down notes and look at them. So going back onto progressive overload. Now, how to actually go about this, there's a couple of different ways in which you can do this. With progressive overload, there's the idea of maybe, and I'm going to actually pull up my screen here to kind of help people visualize it a little bit better if it does help. But say, for instance, what you're seeing right now, a lot of this, you don't have to make sense of it. This is just my current training split. I wrote it down and documented it for my own sake, but also in case other people are curious on what that looks like. So I'll go ahead and leave the link in the description of this video if you're interested. Again, it's just something that I use. It's not something that I'm recommending to everybody, but I'm going to be using this just to kind of visualize what I'm talking about here. So say, for instance, on this day, right, we have this day and it is a push day. Say, for instance, that's what I'm doing today. And on this push day, I have these exercises that I'm planning on doing, right? So I already have a plan. Great. And I already have planned how many sets I have for each of these exercises. So for barbell bench press, I'm going to be doing this for 2 to 3 sets, depending on how I'm feeling. I might do a third set. If I'm not feeling too great, maybe I'll only do 2 sets. I'm going to be doing dips for 2 sets, dumbbell shoulder press for 2 sets, single arm cable tricep pushdowns for 2 sets, and so on, right? So I have written down how many sets I'm doing for each of these exercises, right? Just for me to be aware of that. So say for instance, I'm at the gym today, and during today's session, I'm say for instance, just starting off fresh, haven't done these things before, and it's my first day. I go to the barbell bench press and I do the barbell bench press 2 times. So for 2 sets, I do it each for 5 repetitions, and those feel pretty good to me, right? Those feel good. Maybe I could do a little bit more, but for today, that's just how much I did for that exercise, right? 2 sets, 5 repetitions each, right? So what that'll allow me to do, say for instance, I have that written down, and I'm going to use my fabulous paint skills here to kind of help you visualize this. So I did 2 sets, right, for this week. So we did it for week 1. So week 1, we did our first set. We did this for 5 repetitions, and we did another set for 5 repetitions. Next week, I want to go ahead and do this exercise again, right? Again, in my previous videos, that's what I recommend. Keep things consistent. If you're following a plan, make sure you do that plan, right? Week 2 comes around, and I'm back on this exercise. I'm trying to do the barbell bench press again. What are some things that I should be looking to improve for this time? Well, I could try to increase the weight. So that's one. Maybe I did 135 pounds last time, and I try to increase the weight for next time. Okay, that's an improvement. I could do that. What if I don't want to do that? What if I feel like I don't really feel too comfortable trying to increase the weight right now? Let me just stick with the same weight, but still try to find a way to improve upon the exercise. Okay, well, what I can do is on my first set, I can try to go for 6. I can try to go for 6 reps. That alone is already an improvement of last time, right? So this in itself is already you applying the principles of progressive overload. And that's already telling you that I have improved. I am making gains because of this, right? So that's great. That could be something that you plan to do for your next session. And say, for instance, on your second set, maybe you just can't push it to 6, but you did 5. So same as last time. This is still an improvement. You improved on this exercise, even if it was just increasing the rep by 1, that's a huge improvement, right? So that's great, right? That's you applying the principles of progressive overload. And you keep repeating this process literally for all the exercises that you do. You can either increase the repetitions that you do, or you can increase the weight. You make that call on whatever feels best for that week. Maybe sometimes you're not just feeling the greatest and you're a bit too cautious on increasing the weight. Again, you really won't know that unless you go into the gym. And also if maybe you need a spotter or something of that sort, just to make sure that you are safe when you're doing it, right? But that's a way for you to progressively overload. Now, say for example, let's get rid of all this. You know, we talked about increasing the repetitions. We've talked about increasing the weights. What other ways can we progressively overload? There are really a number of different ways in which you can apply this. Again, just with the definition that I went ahead and told you guys, you doing better than last time, that can be seen in a couple of different ways. Another way that's super, in my opinion, a pretty great thing for you to do and to progressively overload, especially for the new people out there. A lot of times when you're doing these exercises, you don't have the best technique. I don't mean to, that sounds a little bit I don't mean to sound that like in a mean way, but that's just the reality, right? When you're starting something new, you're not going to be the best at it, right? That's kind of the whole purpose of these videos and how you're doing your own research. So maybe your technique just isn't the greatest and you recognize that. You can either record yourself when you're doing some of these exercises. Maybe you watch a tutorial on how to do an exercise and you're trying to match that. But again, your technique, your form, maybe that's something that you want to improve. And quite honestly, especially for the people out there that are just starting out, I would highly, highly, highly recommend for you to try to improve your technique. You'd put that I guess, on the higher list of priorities as opposed to these other forms of progressive overload. I'd put that much higher. Only reason why I say that is because your technique, if it isn't the greatest, you do run the risk of injuring yourself. And that is the last thing that you obviously want, right? You don't want to injure yourself. You want to make sure that you're doing these things as safely as possible. So by you getting a better understanding as to how to improve your technique, you really limit that chance, right? So really, really prioritize improving your technique, especially for the new people out there, right? But that could be a way in which you progressively overload. It might not seem so apparent, but it actually is. Say, for instance, week one, we're doing barbell bench press, right? You're doing your first set, you're only doing it for 5. Second set, you're only doing it for 5. All right, say on the next week, say for instance, you weren't too pleased by your technique. Maybe you noticed that if we're doing barbell bench press, your butt came off the bench, or your feet weren't flat on the ground, right? Something that you notice that wasn't that great. The next time around, you should be looking at improving that technique. But by you doing that alone, again, that's you being better than the previous time. You're still applying the principles of progressive overload, right? Even though on paper, you didn't really improve, your technique did, so you did progressively overload. So, week 2, you come back to this, you did 5, and you do 5. But your technique was improved. Maybe you fixed those things that you talked about. So you fixed that now this time your feet were flat on the ground, your butt didn't come off the bench, and maybe you even incorporated a little bit of an arch just for better stability. So you doing these 3 things, that made this exercise overall better for you. You improved. And by that definition that I just stated, that is, in my opinion, progressive overload. And that is something that should not be overlooked. Again, your technique should be high on that priority list of ways for you to progressively overload, especially for people just starting out. So please, please keep this in mind when you're trying to find out how you want to progressively overload on some of these exercises, right? So that's another example. Now, the last example that I have for you, again, there's probably a lot more out there. I'm just showing you maybe some of the more common ones. Shorter rest times. And this can be especially helpful for you guys and girls out there that are very much into like high intensity exercises where you're doing a lot of supersets or drop sets, things of that sort. If that's really the split that works for you and you want to go ahead and do that, that's fine. But again, your way in which you progressively overload might just be a bit different than others who aren't doing that, right? So maybe for you, because your split is so much time dependent because you're just going, bam, bam, bam to different things. Time might be something that you use as progressive overload. We haven't talked about time in the previous examples yet. So what could that look like? Well, say for instance, your first week, you're doing a specific exercise. You do it for your first set and you're doing this 10 times. For the next set, you do this again for 10 times. Next week, when you come back to this, you do the same thing. 1 to 2 sets, you do this 10 times. But what you do change is, again, the time in between each of these sets. So maybe in the first week, the time that you took, That's supposed to be an arrow. The time that you took in between both of these sets, you gave yourself about like 3-ish minutes. And maybe for this time, and I realize that my face is covering this, so I'm going to put this right here. So maybe for the second week, you do this, you give yourself 2 minutes, right? 2 minutes of rest. Again, you didn't change the repetitions, you didn't change the weight. You, for the most part, had the same technique because your technique is already good. So what you did was just change the time. And that alone is already an improvement. You were able to do the same with little or less time. That's a way of progressive overload. So you kind of see where I'm getting at now, right? With these examples where progressive overload, it's something that you can do in a number of different ways, but really the core fundamental idea behind it is the same for all of these examples. You're just doing these things better. You're either improving your technique, increasing the weight, increasing the amount of reps, maybe decreasing the time. There's probably a whole list of things that you can be doing to be better, but these are all forms of progressive overload. So, and you can probably notice you can notice that I'm like really trying to I'm really trying my best here to make sure that this is as simple and clear cut as possible, but also I'm like kind of almost passionate for this stuff. The reason why I say it is because there is, and this is just from my experience, maybe others have a bit of a differing experience, but when it first came, or when I first got around to doing research on fitness, really when I started to become a bit more efficient with how I trained, I remember earlier on, there was just a ton of content that I was absorbing that just made this and a lot of other topics a lot more complicated than it needed to be. And also, I felt like a lot of the information didn't really make that much sense. A lot of it was pretty false, where some people would say things like, progressive overload is only, increasing the weight and that's it. Or, progressive overload, they went on a whole tangent on what it is and how to do it, right? Not really making it too practical. But I always felt and was left very confused with those videos. Maybe it's just because, I don't know, I'm not someone who really learns in that way. I like to keep things as simple as possible. That's just what makes the most sense in my brain. So maybe for those more complicated topics, I just need to do that. But I feel like a lot of people kind of felt the same way, where there was just a lot of content out there that you were kind of just left like, I'm just a bit confused. So hopefully this helps kind of clear the air on that stuff. And especially for you people just learning about this for the first time, it makes sense. Again, just keeping the definition basic. But again, progressive overload does not have to be complicated. It's just finding a way in which you can do better than last time. And whatever that way is, that's up to you. But I just showed you a couple of examples on how you can go ahead and do that. And you just use your best judgment in which, in what you want to select. Those tend to be the most common ones, and those are the ones that I really utilize personally. So I tend to just switch it up depending on what I feel like doing. Also, what is also fun for me. Do I want to, try to increase the weight for next time? Maybe I'm feeling really energized and really good, and I want to go ahead and just try to increase the weight. And I have a spotter with me, so that's even better, right? I'm still being safe about it, right? So whatever that scenario is for you, just try to find an example, one of these examples that is applicable to you, and just stick with that. And really utilize progressive overload over time. By you applying this concept or this principle of progressive overload, there's no reason for you really not to see progress. If you are progressively overloading on all of these exercises, you will see progress in terms of your physique, obviously your strength, things of that sort. And if you think about it, again, I'm not some sort of health expert when it comes down to this stuff, right? I didn't go to school for this, but it makes sense when you are continuously putting more and more healthy stress onto your body, right? Again, increasing the weight, doing something of that sort. That is you just putting, again, healthy stress onto your body, and your body needs to find a way to adapt to that. So, what is it going to do? Well, it's probably going to build muscle. It's going to improve your cardiovascular system. It's going to do all these things just to make you a better athlete overall. So just try to do better. That's the biggest thing. Try to do better than your previous attempt and make sure that you log this stuff so that it's not confusing for you and you don't leave it really up to chance on what you're doing. The last thing that I will say on progressive overload is when you go ahead and apply these things over to your training split, what you'll come to find is there might need to be different ways in which you progressively overload as you get more and more advanced. When you just first start out, and I'm only speaking from experience here, but you might have heard the whole phenomenon of newbie gains, right? Newbie gains. Newbie gains are very much a real thing. At least to me, they were. Where earlier on, when you first start training and your body's not really used to these things, you tend to either put on muscle or put on strength pretty quickly. I remember earlier on, I was able to increase my squat by like 5 to 10 pounds every single session, and that kept up for some time. But there comes to a point where that will kind of slowly decline, and you'll see you won't be able to make those jumps as quickly. You still can, but it just won't happen that quickly, and that's perfectly normal. That is definitely a real thing, and you just have to really adapt your training to that once you get to that point, right? But if what you're doing is giving you the results in a time and way that you enjoy and that's fine for you, just keep doing what you're doing. There's no really need to fix something that's not broken, right? So keep doing what you're doing. But if you find yourself over time that, man, I just can't keep increasing the weight as quickly anymore, maybe that should be an indication to you that you should try to find another way to progressively overload for that exercise. So maybe try to decrease the rest time. Maybe you can increase the repetitions that you're doing, right? That's where you really start going through and experimenting with what works best for you. But again, if what you're doing right now is working and you're enjoying it, just keep doing what you're doing. There's not really any reason for you to change that, right? So that's really the last thing that I wanted to kind of leave this video off at. And if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the comments or any thoughts about this topic. Again, I'm not someone who is a professional expert on this stuff. I'm just a guy that likes to lift, and these things that I'm talking about today are things that worked for me and that are still working for me. And so, again, there's a ton of content out there that, at least in my opinion, isn't always the greatest to view. And a lot of it also has to come down to, and this is like kind of like a whole nother tangent, but with a lot of these quote unquote influencers out there, a lot of them are always backed up by some sort of product that they're trying to sell you, or there's some sort of service that they're offering. And so because of that, they might be saying some things just to kind of push you into getting some of those, products or services that they're selling, when in reality, maybe what they're saying isn't the most true. And so I feel like I've definitely noticed that over the years when it comes down to this type of content, right? So making this stuff make the most sense for you is going to be your best bet, just so you don't kind of funnel yourself into that pool, right? Where you're not kind of tricked into doing something that's not actually real, right? Make sure that you understand this type of content, and the best way for you to understand this is just by making it as simple as possible, right? Or at least it was for me. So anyways, thank you guys again for watching the video. And yeah, if you have any questions or comments or concerns, please feel free to post them in the comments. But I will catch you guys for the next one. All right. Thank you guys.